Hi, everybody. My name is Diana. This is a talk about a game that I made in Clojure. I touch computers for fun and profit. I make games because it's fun. I made a game called The Longtime in Clojure, and I want to tell you about it. The Longtime is a nomadic city builder that you can play in your browser from your computer or phone or tablet. You play as the guiding spirit, the Longtime of a migratory herd, representing its consensus about where to go and what to do. The herd travels in a circular migratory path season by season, sowing fields and building things only to return to them later. Sow now, harvest later, build now, use later. The herd begins at the dawn of agriculture, working with stone tools and simple structures. But eventually, with the help of their homeworld's other sapient peoples, they will build gravity batteries, atomic reactors, and even spaceships. Along the way, individuals will join the herd and be raised in it, grow, learn, age, and die. They will face challenging events as a herd and consult their Longtime in their dreams. The migration path will grow and change to support a larger herd and more complex infrastructure. Okay, let me show you the basics. All right. So this is the intro sequence. One of our little characters is praying a long time into being. It's both a spirit and a cultural concept. So what kind of long time are we working with here? How about Clojure conj? All right, and then here's your herd. Over here we have our welcome. On the left we have a description of the herd itself. Some rules, yada, yada, yada. And then comes the main game loop. You start in a location, you choose some projects. It's really hard to see from up here. And a dreamer visits you. Dreams happen, events happen. This is the duty of the Longtime. Then you take stuff with you or leave it behind. You choose your next location, and it starts all over again. Great. All right, there's the next slide. Okay. Okay, let's talk about process. I made the Longtime for many reasons, but I only have 10 minutes, so let's stick to process rather than motive. First, long before I wrote a lick of code, I wrote a design document. It was a rambling journal entry about how the game might hypothetically play, how it should feel, how mechanics work, and then it sat there for a year while I hacked on other stuff. And then I had a stroke of inspiration, and I expanded that initial design document into comprehensive documentation, and then I got started on code. I want to emphasize the importance of design documents to game development. I have found it more rewarding and more effective to fully understand what I'm building than to have a demo of something I only half grok. Sometimes a demo is the key to further steps, but as a hobbyist, I've never been in that situation. Don't feel bad if the artifacts you're producing don't look like a game yet. Don't feel bad if you don't have the inspiration quite yet, though inspiration isn't necessary to earnest expression. Write down what you have and listen to it for as long as you need. Okay, now let's talk about code. The Longtime has several major dependencies that I'll highlight. First, perhaps obviously, Clojure. I chose Clojure because it's terse, expressive, and it has a big, weird ecosystem. And furthermore, I have fun writing it. Getting to parasite the JVM and JavaScript from a Lisp feels poetic, not to mention incredibly powerful. For transpiling my code to JavaScript, I chose to use Shadow CLJS. It integrates well with NPM, and I have a long history with JavaScript that helps me get the most out of its quirks. For persisting saved games, I used PouchDB, a JavaScript in-browser database based on CouchDB. This is my go-to solution for in-browser data management because it gives you CRUD and MapReduce queries. For CSS, I used the framework Bulma, which has defaults I find inoffensive. I don't have much of an aesthetic sense, so I like being able to build on other people's opinions. Lastly, I used Reagent for the UI. Reagent is a wrapper around React that makes it more idiomatic for Clojure. No more extending classes and overriding methods. With reagent, it's just functions and vectors. To me, React is better in Clojure. If you're thinking about doing offline-first web development in Clojure, including for business applications, consider these technologies. They honestly make it a breeze. Regarding the architecture of the game's logic, I divided the problem into one of rules and one of representation. Rules can be reduced to processes, to functions, and those functions and their inputs and outputs can be specified, spec'd, if you will. I love the spec system in Clojure. I know there's legitimate critiques of Clojure Spec Alpha, but I'm a simple person, and I don't mind a little global state as a treat. I certainly like it better than defining classes in Python or JavaScript. The best thing about the spec system to me, I'll explain with 2 screenshots. The first is the source for Spec Test Sims, a function I wrote after my colleague Ted Cushman told me about Clojure Spec Test Alpha. This function takes a list of namespace symbols and validates them against their own spec in a property test of several iterations. Functions given valid output are expected to produce valid output. Great, 12 lines. The second is a test using Spec Test Sims in the core test namespace. It subjects every core game function to a comprehensive check with numerous trials, and each test requires only to name the thing. 67 lines, 65 tests. I have other tests that verify specific interactions that my specs overlooked. Specs generally don't contain the context that game rules really possess, such as the order of the seasons or geometry. But at the end, after all the tests are written, you have a test suite that can play the game from start to finish. All the rules are there as a high-level vocabulary for you to use, and you already know they work well. The Longtime doesn't actually have a test that plays the game. I tried that for another game called Planet Call, and it revealed a lot of the test, particularly performance issues. It required a great deal of contrived engineering to keep my computer player out of infinite choice loops, designing units only to forget them over and over and over and over, that sort of thing. It's a neat trick if you can manage it, but it presents considerable architectural challenges. Instead, the Longtime has a test that generates herds and validates that anything they could do leaves the game in a valid state. It's much faster and more deterministic than having a random number generator fumble around for problems. With your rules vocabulary in hand, it's time to write the UI. In all, the Longtimes clocks in at 712 lines. Unlike what you might think for video games, its UI is all HTML and reagent expressions. Boxes, text, tables, and buttons. It's more like kitten game than Call of Duty. This lets me rely on CSS conventions to build a decent interface quickly. For Planet Call, that other game I mentioned, I ended up using a JavaScript game engine, Phaser, in order to use canvas and sprites for a more traditional 4x interface. Because Phaser is obsessively object-oriented, Clojure script interop was actually enough of a pain that I began exporting my rules engine as a transpiled JavaScript object so that I could just write my UI in JavaScript directly. I've been told this wasn't necessary. Maybe when I get back to developing it, I'll figure it out. Finally, I want to talk about the text content of the game. Code is data, and data is code, yeah. But some things are easier to make into Eden files than others. For some games, I've been able to create declarative syntaxes for the bulk of the game's content. For the Longtime, I had a harder time and didn't prioritize it. This was because of how many subsystems had complex functional components. Events and dreams have complicated effects that weren't easy to categorize in a syntax. It was just more practical to stick to a Turing-complete environment than to invent a way to stick it in resource files. All right, that's all my time. My name is Belle, and this has been a talk about the Longtime. Thank you for listening.